So, welcome back to Round Rant, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Graham Linehan, who was the creator of Father Ted and other TV shows such as The IT Crowd, Black Books, and Big Train. Graham also recently has published his own book called Tough Crowd: How I Made and Lost a Career in Comedy, which talks about his life story to date. So, Graham, thanks a million for coming on, and how is all with you today?
Yeah, good, good. Yeah, things are going pretty well at the moment, actually, for the first time in a long time. Been getting some nice reviews for the book, and it's selling pretty well. So yeah, found me in a good
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 stuff. Good to
place.
hear. And yeah, before we maybe get into the book and some of your life work, I always like to ask people, and it's probably more relevant now, especially with the last week we've experienced as Irish people, that like about people's childhoods and how the world was presented to you at an early age. But say yourself when you were taking your first steps and realizing what world was surrounding you, like what was Ireland like growing up when you were a young boy?
God, well, I mean, it was pre-internet, obviously, so it was doing things like getting into abandoned cement mixers and being turned upside down, getting pallets and trying to make a boat on giant pools of water that looking back, climbing up to the top of the scaffolding of churches that were being built. I mean, it's astonishing that any of us
Yeah,
made it out alive, you know. But yeah, it was slightly stultifying. I found an escape in literature and movies and music, uh, all of which I kind of grasped onto as quickly as I could because it was the only thing that was alleviating the boredom for me. The boredom was made up of, school and learning things I didn't really understand why I had to know them. Um, y- and also, just kind of getting bullied a lot, escaping into books and movies and music through because of that too. Um, and then later on, using comedy as a way of, I don't know, I made a sort of a name for myself in school when I started doing debates because I would just turn them into stand-up comedy routines. I'm ashamed to say I did plagiarize a lot for
yeah.
those debates from Woody Allen. People were kind of confused as to why I was suddenly calling people schmucks, and it was because of that. But um, but yeah, I kind of made it through then to adulthood, and again there was like another, I'd say, about 10 years before the internet came along, and that was spent writing music journalism and uh, finally persuading Arthur Matthews to come over, who was the guy I wrote Father Ted with, um, and just trying our hand at comedy.
Yeah.
We'd already done a little bit of it in Dublin, uh, written a few sketches for ourselves to perform, and we just thought, well, why not? We knew we had a good sense of humor. Um, so we decided to try it out on the
Yeah,
Brits. You
and
know,
it's a good audience to test yourself out. And you mentioned Arthur there, who obviously you collaborated a huge amount with, and like even with Father Ted and whatnot. And what was it? Well over a year ago, I had Bill Oakley on, who was one of the famed writers of The Simpsons, and he had a collaborator as well. Who he felt that like if he didn't have him by his side, he probably wouldn't have gotten into writing. It was great to have someone to bounce ideas off, but in his words, take, well, not his exact words, but take the piss out of. And you kind of had built up that
yes,
chemistry. And with yourself, having, say, Arthur at that early stage of the writing process and bouncing ideas off, like, how would you describe yourself as a duo? Was it a bit of yin and yang? Were you completely polar opposites? Were you the same type of person? Like, how did it evolve at the early stages?
yeah, it was yin and yang is a good way of putting it. In fact, I heard a writing teacher, uh, what he divides writers into left brain and right brain writers. Left brain writers are very creative, I think, but they don't have much patience for things like structure and setups and payoffs and all that sort of thing. right brain writers, and it might be
Yeah.
the other way around. I can't remember which is which, but right brain writers, I believe, are much more. They do appreciate structure, and they do kind of plot things out and make sure everything makes sense. Um, Arthur was definitely the former. His ideas were explosively surreal and hilarious, but sometimes they might run on for a few pages without actually
Mm.
having an ending or connecting to the story. So I just quickly realized that like I could take some of the stuff he was doing and I just steered a car a little bit towards things that made sense in the context of the story, you know. Um, and just his, and also I was always like a magpie in my influences, and just hanging around with Arthur, you picked up the language, you picked up the way his particular sense of humor, um, and it was just such a rich sense of humor that it kind of powered us through all the sketches we wrote for Big Train and all that sort of thing. I mean, we wrote hundreds of sketches for Big Train, only a percentage of which
Yeah.
ended up on screen. And Father Ted too, we could just write and write and write, and yeah, it was just a great collaboration because I might sit down and write something, then Arthur would see it and apply his imagination to it, and then I would see it and apply mine again and try and figure out, does it fit in the story? Are we writing a story, or are we going off the point? Um, and yeah, we just had two roles that worked kind of great with each other. You know, um, yeah, definitely without a doubt the best collaboration I've ever had, and I would suggest that anyone who is getting into comedy really does keep your eye out for people like that. People who have, as I said in the book, a touch of the divine
Yeah.
about them. Like they've been just graced by a sense of humor that is almost unworldly. Because no one else was making jokes like Arthur. No one else was saying things the way he was saying them, or had precisely his eye for the surreal. Um, so yeah, it was a wonderful yin and yang
Yeah,
collaboration.
for sure.
You
And
know.
you mentioned some of the earlier works you had, like Big Train, and it seemed like, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong, but like the Fast Show was probably perhaps the first maybe big TV show that kind of showcased your pure writing or kind of creative talents. And
Well, Smith and Jones before that, but yeah, the Fast Show was more our style, I guess. Smith and Jones was more
mm,
conventional,
yeah,
probably, but it was very useful to us in that it was where we learned how to construct a sketch and how to write something with a beginning, middle, and
mm,
end. Um,
no, no, no.
yeah. Sorry.
Thank you for that. And what I was leading to there was that I know you've got one or two origin stories of how Father's Head came together, but like, was there specific life experiences or maybe even influences that really forced you or inspired you to create Father Ted in the first place?
No, I mean the only life experience I could point to would be watching Arthur do the character
Mm,
on stage. Like Arthur used to do him as a stand-up, and he had a way of delivering the character that was just extremely funny. It was certain kind of voice you don't hear in comedy clubs. It's very innocent, unworldly. The jokes he would tell would be semi-accidental. Like there's a very good example of a type of joke Arthur would tell that ended up in the series. But I don't know if you remember the one where Claire Grogan came around playing a sort of version of Sinead
yeah.
O'Connor, a very woke pop star, and Ted sees the cover of a magazine and he says, and where she's the headline is
Yeah,
Clit
I do
Power,
remember that.
and Ted says, maybe she's talking about. I used to know a Father Clint Power. Well, maybe she's having a go at him. He literally doesn't even know what the word means. that was the kind of thing we absolutely loved with Ted, where he would kind of stumble into jokes without realizing almost that they were funny. The classic one we always, I would always quote to people because it's such a perfect live joke to say in a live setting. Is he'd look out at the crowd and he'd say, "If anyone at the back can't see, say hello to them. They're from St. Kevin's School for the Blind." So it was like, and he had the voice in his head because he had two uncles who were priests. And so when you ask about the real life experience, the real life experience probably came from Arthur, because he would meet these, he loved his uncles and would meet them every so often and just come back with stories about them, and they would be similar kind of unworldly stories. Like the one I tell in the book is he he was there once. This was a time when cassettes were still available, and he said he was there once, and one of the priests said to the other, "Put on the Strokes tape." And Arthur was like, "What? They're listening to the
Yeah.
Strokes, who were big at the time." And they put on the tape, and it was a voice going, "When you have a stroke, lie down on your side."
Yeah.
Or if you're with someone who's had a stroke, lie them down on their side. It was a tape about how to deal with people who'd had a stroke. So it was stuff like that, just endlessly funny. And when you spoke to Arthur, you would quickly get kind of caught up in this world, uh, you know, and it fired your imagination, like we would. It's where things like the idea of priest socks being an extra dark color of black that
Yeah.
isn't available anywhere else. This nonsense kind of came easily to us, simply because of, yeah, it's an absurd view of the world that I think I did have and I shared, but I learned a lot more of it from Arthur. I picked up a lot more of it from
Yeah.
Arthur.
And I think he said it in the book where I think the term was paddy whack. No, paddy whacking. Yeah,
Paddy
whackery.
Wackery.
Excuse me.
Paddy Wack.
And
Yeah, yeah,
you've gone on record extensively and said you didn't like about Father Ted. You didn't want to take the complete piss out of the Irish, but you were always confident enough that it was always going to be funny enough and it would work out in the end. But from the construction of the show, you had so many options with Father Ted, so many avenues to go down, so many like kind of key narratives to pursue, and like the thing that often gets overlooked, and I've rewatched a lot of the episodes over the last several weeks to kind of just remind myself of some of the content and gags, but like the priests doing their like day-to-day lives is kind of one of the subsets of what people would expect. And what I mean by that is like you focus on the day-to-day lives of them rather than them doing, the society kind of outlook as to what priests would do, which is like saying mass and doing funerals and doing
sure.
bits and bobs. And whenever you showcase that, you think I'd like the clip of Dougal's funeral. It's obviously one of the better ones, but even like Ted
Yeah,
doing the 10-second mass when the nuns arrive, it's nearly like
yes.
an idea, not necessarily to dismiss the church or practical side of being a priest, but like was it always your intention to make it nearly unnoticeable within the TV show, or like in most cases like a bit of a farce, like you've got Bishop Brennan throwing throwing away his superiors when he realizes he's got kicked up the arse?
Yeah, yeah. Well, like we were told a couple of things when we were writing it. One of the things we were told was avoid making fun of uh, central tenets of belief. In, like, for instance, the virgin
Mm.
birth. They said avoid that, you'll be okay. And the thing is, it didn't really come up for us a lot, that type of thing, because as you say, we weren't really talking about them in their working hours. Arthur, in fact, made it a rule. He said we never see them at work. That was his key thing. We never see them at work. And I kind of didn't understand it at first. And then later on, I heard him in an interview saying, there were all these other ecclesiastical sitcoms. Leave It to Mrs. O'Brien was an
Mm.
Irish one. There was another one called All Gas and Gators. And these sitcoms all showed them at work doing christenings, confessions, all that sort of thing. And the thing about that is that if we had done the same, we might have ended up looking just like one of those sitcoms. So for us, it was all about the downtime. We found it very funny, the idea that, like, and this is not true. Priests, I'm sure, have very full days, but we pretended that anytime they weren't doing a mass or a confession, they were just playing Ludo and stuff like this. And that just kind of amused us because it was like, one of the other things about TED, it's kind of slightly connected, these kind of brainless activities they would be involved with, but it's slightly connected to the idea that if you were to think too much about God and the implications of things like the virgin birth and heaven and hell and all that stuff, you would
Mm,
go mad, you know, because it's frightening. Some of it is really disturbing. Some of the implications. I don't know if you've ever read Flannery O'Connor's short stories, but all her stories are about a kind of holy terror that that come about because they happen in the story because of her belief in the Catholic Church. She goes very far down that road of kind of, as I say,
mm,
holy terror. Um, and so Ted and Dougal just spend their days trying to push away all thoughts of the
yeah,
spiritual because they're a little frightened by it. And Ted's obviously Ted's interests are much more kind of venal and earthbound. Um, and it just made sense for him not to have or to be embarrassed by religion. That's one thing Arthur would say. Arthur said, whenever priests he knew, whenever the subject got onto religion, they'd get very
mm,
embarrassed and try and change the subject. Um, and yeah, so all these things just kind of together they gave us a framework to approach the show that meant we'd never go down the road of, I don't know, showing Ted doing a drunken
yeah,
christening or something, and dropping the baby or something. It was all other stuff, and yeah, it worked out. It was a good rule
yeah.
for us.
No,
You
for
know.
sure. And it's a good point you made there about even some of my friends who maybe could be pro athletes or maybe in the entertainment business. When they meet, say, strangers or at an event, the last thing they want to hear is about their profession. Like they actually come up to me and they're like, "Oh, it's actually
Yeah,
great because we didn't talk about me and what I do." So it's probably a fair
yes,
point, and definitely, as you said, it did work in our
yeah,
favor. And with the four main characters of Jack, Dougal, Ted, and Mrs. Doyle, I've always wondered because it just works so well. And like most great comedies, it just works. It's like The Simpsons, the family just simply works. But like, was there ever a fifth character, or was it always going to maybe be four males or three males, or was it just set in stone from the beginning that it was going to be the alcoholic, the
yeah.
idiot, the guy who ran away with money, and very caring but often overlooked housekeeper?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It solidified into that group very quickly. They all came from a parody documentary, mock documentary we wrote called Irish Lives, which had Ted visiting all the old priests he used to know in the seminary, and it was really like a bunch of sketches tied together because we were writing a lot of sketches at the time. We didn't really know how to write a sitcom yet, so we wrote this Irish Lives thing, I mean, which starts off with Ted looking at the camera talking as he's driving along, and he immediately gets into a crash. There's stuff like that, and he met one priest who was dead, and he didn't realize it, and just talked to him for ages until people come in and say, "Oh, he's dead." Now that when we took when we started writing it as a sitcom, we took that scene and made that character Father Jack. It became the sixth episode where
Yeah.
Jack dies, um, and so then we wrote this. We wrote the sixth episode first, handed it in. And we only handed in half of it. We were still kind of finding it hard to believe they wanted a sitcom from us. And they wrote back and they said, "This is really good, but one of the characters is dead, and we still don't really know what it's about." So we had to kind of we then had to go back and say, okay, so who are these people? What are they doing there? I think just from writing dialogue and talking about it and swapping ideas back and forth, the idea came about that they were all on the island for various crimes, things they'd done, not literal crimes, but crime, the things the Catholic Church would
Yeah.
consider crimes. Actually, in Ted's case, kind of a crime. Um, but like that really worked. One of the things Griff Rhys Jones told us was that you need a trap in the sitcom, some reason why the characters have to be together. Because if they didn't have to be together, why would they hang around with other people who
Yeah.
annoy them so much? So the Catholic Church gave us this brilliant one because we'd noticed that in all the sex scandals, one of the things the Catholic Church tended to do was move people from parish to parish, something that had appalling consequences in the real world because they were moving very dangerous men from parish to parish. But in our show, uh, it was a lighter thing. Ted wasn't a predatory
Yeah.
sex maniac. He just had some sort of financial irregularities. Dougal, I remember. I think we said something like those nuns were injured. I can't remember exactly how it goes, but Dougal caused
Oh, he
some
says
harm
they
to
were
some
only
nuns.
nuns, I think he said. Yeah.
They were only nuns. Yeah, that's right. And Frank. Father Jack was us trying to address the stories I guess we'd heard of when the church was really bad. Like, I don't know if you know about the Christian Brothers who taught my dad and were apparently psychopaths, So we wanted something that represented the old church, that had a lot of control over Ireland and that had too much power, and had been corrupted as a result. And so we gave all that to Frank, to Father Jack. So yeah, I'm not sure if we actually went in and decided that's what the story is, or whether I think it's more likely it happened this way around. We were probably writing out loads of scenes to try and get to know the characters, and just for our own amusement, and probably at one point, you know, uh, the Bishop Brennan said, uh, you know, Dougal, you did this, and your only nuns just they were only nuns just popped out of Dougal's mouth. The way the lines would
Mm.
often do that. We almost didn't expect it. We used to say it was like turning on a tape recorder and just listening to them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They just talked. They talked and talked and talked, and everything they said was funny. And sometimes the funniest things would become part of what you might call the show's canon. Canon. um, and we just kept, it gradually built up a picture that was consistent and made sense, and is very useful for when you want an audience to return again and again to a show and enjoy it. you know like, we could be mad, but we had to create rules and strictures, that meant that the show just didn't float away on a cloud of
Yeah.
whimsy. you know so yeah, it was an interesting, what's the word? There's a word for it, bit by bit, when something is bit by bit. Gradual, and
Progression.
it's not gradual. It's no, it's
Okay.
iterative. It was an iterative process, and yeah, it was just great. It was just going to work every day, laughing our heads off, and at the end of it, just trying to figure out what we
Yeah.
had, and
And
yeah,
do you
it was
have
good.
a particular scene that you found? Because what I love about Father Ted, and I think you've said it, and I even spoke to Bill Oakley, who, in my opinion, was the best writer for The Simpsons, that you took some nearly Simpsons esque gags out, where, say, the Dougal funeral one, where you're in the moment and then suddenly it just pans to the next scene where it's just complete disaster ensuing with the hearse on fire.
Yeah,
But what I was meaning to say there, was there like a particular scene where maybe it builds up and they're stuck in, say, the living room or somewhere else? Was there like a scene, whether it was you or some of the actors, that was just clearly the funniest to create, or was there so many that it was hard to keep track?
I have a there's a special place in my heart for Flight into Terror because we wrote it in 2 days. It was based on my fear
Mm.
of flying, and it barely changed from the first draft to the last. And like we were so on our game at that stage that when we got about halfway through the show and reached a point where we didn't really know what to do next, um, the idea of the essay competition
Yeah.
to see who gets the last parachute occurred to us, and that was just one of the nicest moments because again, it's almost like you know, you got to realize when Father Ted goes out, by the time it goes out, you never want to
Yeah.
see it again because you've seen it thousands of times. So the time that where we got to experience the story and where we got to laugh was when we were writing it. So when the words "How about an essay competition" or whatever it was came out of the characters' mouths, you know, we just took the rest of the day off.
Mm.
You know, because we were laughing so much, and it just kind of you have an idea like that, and then it creates then a series of mini ideas. Like, what is each essay competition? What is each essay going to look like? And so you know, there's one guy who says, "I think I should get the parachute because
Yeah.
I'm great," and that doesn't go down well. And another guy mishears and draws a picture of himself naked with a dog, you know, and it was just glorious, you know. To me that was like the closest thing to just watching a show and enjoying it. We really just sat there and let them talk,
Yeah.
you know.
Because they are like quite literally confined for 95% of that episode in the airplane. And like, it's funny
Yeah,
because my go to from that particular episode is the captain, who probably, I don't think he appears ever again, but like some of his dialogue and one liners, I think when he looks at sticky tape and just goes, brilliant. Stuff like that is just remarkable.
yeah. He was a
Yeah.
funny actor. He liked to eat
Yeah,
the flicker a bit.
which I think actually
Yeah,
made his character, if he was a bit more subdued, it probably
yeah,
wouldn't have worked. But with the writing process that you've referred back to a bit, and I always find this fascinating. Say Father Ted, like most of the best sitcoms, was it was around what 23 to 25 minutes, around give or take.
yeah. Channel 4 is is 24 and a half
Yeah,
minutes, I think. Yeah,
and how did you find? Because you said you had to kind of learn how to write, and as you said, have a beginning, middle, and end. And a lot of Father Ted's best episodes is when there's just that build up to an impending disaster or a resolution to a disaster. But as you wrote that, and especially with Arthur as well, how did that, like, did that evolve as you made the 3 seasons, or was it very much set in stone? Because I said same thing about the Simpsons, where they had their DNA on how to write a good episode. They also were cautiously aware that, say, I don't know, John and Mary, they didn't want to don't include them too much, because then the magnitude of that scene would drop, or say someone like Larry Duff. So if you could give us an
mm.
insight into how your writing evolved as the show went on, but then also like how did you treat, say, the sub characters and the sub stories as it progressed?
Yeah. Well, the kind of minor characters would come in useful at various points, you know, for various things. Like, for instance, Dougal going to visit John and Mary and asking for
Yeah,
handcuffs and said, they're for me and Ted and all that sort of stuff. The useful little moment there. Um, uh, and it's always good in a comedy to provide some sort of third party perspective who is looking on and not quite seeing the
yeah,
full picture. So you know they obviously go away thinking that Ted and Dougal are into sadomasochistic gay sex, um, but but yeah, I mean, at the start, the main influence for me was The Simpsons. I was just obsessed with it. It was like the golden era. Um, Probably the episodes that you know Oakley wrote. Uh, you know, we're talking about the Clown College
yeah,
episode and things like that. Just glorious, glorious comedy. Um, but it was interesting about The Simpsons. Is what Simpsons is one of those shows where the structure for me is somewhat invisible. It's so visually arresting and interesting and gag ridden that I actually didn't couldn't really pick apart the structure the way I could in other shows. So what happened was, as we were writing Ted, I started to get more and more obsessed with uh,
Yeah,
Seinfeld.
great show.
And yeah, great show. And Seinfeld had a very clear
Yeah,
structure, which was like three unrelated stories that come together at the end in some way. And that's what we started doing. I kind of, I think Arthur was a bit. He once said to me, he didn't feel like he didn't feel as involved in the third series, and it was possibly because I was kind of trying to enforce
yeah,
this structure. Um, which I just thought, and the thing about it is, when you say, okay, we're going to have three stories, they're going to tie together at the very end, then there's a lot less room for some of the more discursive comedy that might have been in the first and second series, where people are just sitting around shooting the shit. Uh, Third series was very, very directional. The stories they all had a very they all had an aim they were trying to hit, or sorry, a target they were
yeah,
trying to hit. um, and Yeah, that was just so I think what happened really was we went from loving the Simpsons and wanting to emulate the Simpsons and doing that however we could, to, by the third series, loving Seinfeld and trying to emulate the really quite lovely structure of that show. Um, so yeah, that's how it went. It was just trying to copy one thing, getting it slightly wrong, and then trying to copy another thing, getting it slightly
yeah.
wrong. That's what Elvis Costello said about music. He said, "Pop music is the history of pop music is people trying to copy other people and getting it
Mm,
slightly wrong." And yeah, that's what we
yeah,
were doing.
true. And with Father Ted, just one of the last things I want to ask about it is like it's aged remarkably well, and I think even
Oh, good.
even well that it's all subjective, as you know, but that's just my take on
Mm,
it. But I feel like with comedy, especially maybe the more modern side, comedy is a bit more treacherous now, but the fact that like still today young people, old people, middle-aged people of all backgrounds still adore it and still quote it on a regular basis, in my opinion, shows that it,
yeah.
it has aged and it is still beloved. But do you ever look back and can you attribute that to anything, or is it just simply because this is even non-Irish people as well who love it? Like,
Mm,
can you put that down to
mm.
anything?
That's a good question, because I was surprised when you said it's aged well, because I often think of lines like Nelson Mandela and his mad wife, which must play to modern audiences, and they think, what are you
Mm,
talking about? Um, and we did have a lot of references to pop culture and so on. But I guess if you take a pop culture reference like Speed
yeah,
3, um, when we turned it into the milk float and all that sort of thing, then it becomes its own thing, and you can enjoy it for its own sake. You don't even necessarily need to know that it's a parody of the Speed films for it to work. So I think maybe that was it. We always had an eye to. We wanted to make sure that you didn't just enjoy it because you were going, oh, I get that reference, I get that reference. We wanted the stories to work and make sense in their own right. In fact, there was one episode where me and Arthur had a big debate about this. The Christmas episode where the character comes down, um, like in Mission
yeah,
Impossible, and I didn't want to use the music because I thought it would tie it too much to that era, and Arthur did, and I think I won. And I'm still actually not sure whether it was the right decision. I may have needed to lose that one, but the fact that we didn't have it, the fact that we didn't have it means that it's not a
yeah,
reference. You know what I mean? It's just a very weird thing that happens. A priest suddenly
yeah.
descends
It's
from the
not on the
ceiling.
nose.
You know, yeah, exactly. So maybe it's little decisions like that that add up and mean that people can enjoy it without necessarily needing to know what the references are.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
and I actually think that's a very important point. And even as you said, like taking the structures from maybe a bit of The Simpsons, bit of Seinfeld, and as you said, they're not keeping it organic. I think that's because like Father Ted has its characters, its quotes, its sad moments, hilarious moments, and that's what makes it repetible. Repetible. I can't speak. Repetible viewing. Yeah, repeatable.
Repeatable,
Excuse me. Thank you.
repeatable.
So
Yeah, don't worry.
that I think the organic nature to it, where you feel like, oh, this isn't a rip off of this show or that show, which we've seen so many times in comedy. But I think that's probably the nature of it, and that's why it works still. And
Yeah, and
yeah,
also
yeah,
if I can add to it, I think there's another thing, which is that we didn't mean to do this, but we sort of accidentally created a family.
yeah,
You know, Ted being the dad, Mrs. Doyle, mum, granddad, Father Jack, and the child as Dougal. And when audiences see themselves reflected, or especially families, when families see themselves reflected, that's a huge thing. That means that it becomes a family event to
yeah,
watch it. You know, so yeah, that was another thing that we did. Again, not deliberately at all, but it turned out
yeah.
great.
And I can even admittedly say, and I don't know for better or worse, but my dad occasionally calls me Dougal. Or back when I'm in the family house for Christmas, I'll be like, I'll say goodnight,
well,
Ted, and he'll say
I,
goodnight, Dougal.
I can beat that. Arnold once said that he based Dougal on me, uh, so I think that's much
Yeah, no,
worse.
you trumped me there. To be fair, but just moving on to not so much specifically the IT crowd, but what you said about that, and I don't want to keep reference it, but it is a useful one. Bill Oakley, when he worked with say Futurama and some of the other projects, he said that we took The Simpsons into those shows, and as a result, we felt like we were trying too hard. And a lot of you have kind of referenced to your time at TED. It was so natural. It didn't really feel like work. You didn't even anticipate it to be as big as it was. But when a writer, in your case, says or looks back on something and says, "Oh, we probably tried too hard," or "We wrote too hard on that," like creative wise, like or creativity wise, what does that actually mean, or what does that look like?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I know exactly why. What are you talking about? Something I said about the IT crowd?
Yes, in one of your interviews, you didn't necessarily say you didn't like it or anything, far from it, but you just said there were times maybe in the writing where you struggled to come up with ideas and you felt like you were working too hard.
Oh yeah. Well, I think there were two reasons for that. The first is that it wasn't as clear a premise as the TED premise. The TED premise was so simple and clear. Three worst priests in the world, in the worst parish in the world. It's brilliant. You get it
Yeah,
immediately. Whereas IT crowd was a little bit harder to explain. Um, it was a little bit. It wasn't as clean an idea as Father Ted. And also, I was writing it on my own, so I didn't have anyone to bounce it off. I was kind of using my experience from previous shows, but in completely new territory. So yeah, it was just a little tougher for that reason. But you know, it was very, and also you kind of sometimes you want someone to fight against you. You want someone to say, no, don't do that. You know, because what you do when that happens, and you really think that they're wrong, and you really want you stress test
yeah,
the idea. You really kind of put it through a number of tests that to see if it stands up, and it's a useful thing. So that didn't really happen on the IT crowd because you know, everybody was like, yes
mm,
sir, you know. um Except for Chris O'Dowd, of course, who had the hardest job in the show, because I hadn't really created a character for him. I kept saying to him, it's me, you're just playing me, you know. um and he was like, "Well, I don't know
yeah,
you," you know, which is fair enough. And you know, he just wanted to create a character himself, or you know, like basically an actor. It's like the script in the end is a very bare bones thing. You know, you might even say you only give an actor 30% of what eventually he does. So Chris had to provide the other 70%, all the pauses between lines, all the reactions to lines, all that sort of stuff. And he needed to know who the character was. So me saying, it's me, it was not
mm,
very useful to him. He gave the character a few of my qualities. He gave him a slouch, which I've had since I was a teenager. Um, uh, I think he copied some parts of my speech, the way I speak, but it was for me the character was based very much on the kinds of guys I used to see hanging around in record shops, very cynical, uh, very superior. You know, every question is a stupid question. And that came about because I also heard from a few people who I knew who worked in tech that a lot of these guys whose job it is to go up and tell people to turn it off and on again are extremely intelligent guys. And so that kind of haughty intelligence um, worked very well as a comic idea because the people who work in the office consider them to be at the bottom of the totem pole, whereas they think that they're smarter than everyone else. So yeah, we just kind of we found our way there eventually. We found our way through talking about the character and through doing each episode. But it would have been an easier job for him and perhaps as well for me if I had defined that character a little bit better from the start. Like yeah, I think it was too I could not figure out what to
Yeah.
call him, you know, which is a really bad thing for a character. And it was only in the third series that I settled on his second name being Treneman because it sounded a bit like my name and was equally
Yeah.
annoying. So so yeah, but having said that, you know, again, it was like a shunky, slapped together idea with character, where we were all finding our way, and it ended up working. So I was very pleased with it in the end. There's some episodes that I would put up there amongst my favorite things that I've written.
Yeah.
You know.
No, there are some. All it takes, if anyone hasn't seen it, just type in the IT crowd best moments, and there'll probably be a lot of Chris O'Dowd's. What would you call it? His phone voicemail popping up, but there were some some good ones along the way. But
Yeah, yeah. Like, and I think that like in terms of structure, I think the theater gay episode is probably the best thing I've
yeah,
written.
I haven't seen that in
Um,
years, but I
you
do
know,
remember it.
yeah, yeah.
It is no, it's a special show, and like a lot of the maybe British TV shows, if you just dig a bit deeper, compared to the offices and whatnot of the world, there's some absolute gems. And yeah, like with regards to all that, that's obviously your the creative side of your work. And to be honest, I could go on for the next 6 hours talking about all the comedy sides of things and what was your favorite Father Jack quote, etc., etc. But with your most recent book, sorry, your book that's just been published, I one of the
Mm.
questions I want to ask was like at this time period of your life, I should say, what was it like a reaction to COVID? Was a reaction to the change in landscapes in your life that made you want to pick up the pencil? Or was this something a decade ago you were like, you know what, in a few years I'd like to sit down and tell my side of the story? Like what made you want to, write a book and put pen to paper?
Oh well, it was it was literally explaining my
Yeah.
position because my position on the trans issue, which is what I got involved in, was being misrepresented. So to such an extent that even people who were close to me were calling me names and believing the worst rumors that were floating around online. So I kind of figured that the only way I could actually address it was by writing a book about it. You know, um, I also kind of thought that once the book came out, there would be also interviews, such as this one, where again I could
Yeah.
explain myself and explain my positions. So if you do that enough, I thought maybe I'd be able to counteract the kind of black propaganda that's been spread around about me, including my Wikipedia page. You know, so yeah, that was it really. And also, I needed to make some money because I suddenly had no income. You
Yeah.
know, um, beyond my website where I post about journalism about this stuff. Um, so yeah, that was it really. Literally just survival. So
Yeah.
you know,
And And like with the book, it's like well over, I'd say about 100, 130, 140 pages is dedicated to the topic around trans people and the views you have on that topic. And me watching from afar, like transgender kind of ideology is it's every day on the news. There's different takes on it, and like even yourself, it's kind of well established now that like the Father Ted musical was scrapped due to your views
Mm.
on it. And
Mm-hmm.
like this is just me reading like comments, like a lot of women are in favor of your support, and likewise there's a lot of people against your support. But knowing that in the society we now exist in, where it's you can see it's a top end politics in the States, you're either Trump or Biden, and if you're Biden and someone supports Trump, they're an idiot, and vice versa. So it's a very
Mm.
contrast in society and a very aggressive one we live in, unfortunately, when you're either right or wrong. There's no middle ground or discussion. But my question on the back of that is, with say some of the negative effects it's had, and here you are today still holding those views, which I respect entirely. Do you ever question like why did you feel the need to like speak out on the matter, even if it would come at such a cost? Or do you feel all my points, all my views outweigh all the misgivings and setbacks I may have along the way?
Well, yeah. I mean, look. In the end, the most important aspect of this is the fact that children are being hurt. You know, I genuinely do not understand why everyone isn't joining this fight. You know, we have young kids who are being told if they display any kind of gender non-conforming traits, as one gay friend of mine put it, if they walk down the wrong aisle in a toy shop, they are being misdiagnosed as trans and put on a pathway that could very well lead to endless hospital visits, destroyed sexual function, um, and certainly a shortened life. The effect of cross-sex hormones like testosterone on women is appalling. Women, if you start young enough, you will go into the menopause 20 years too early, excuse me, 20 years too early. So you have these young girls who've been lied to and told that if they take these drugs, they'll turn into boys. And in fact, what they're doing is turning into old women, you know, the same with the same medical problems that old women get. Like menopause is no
Mm.
joke, it kind of increases the chances of things like dementia, you know. Also, testosterone, the effect on women's bodies is really uh, quite extreme. It increases the risk of heart failure. Heart attacks suddenly become something that could affect a girl in her 20s. You know, I was seeing lots of accounts of young women who had to have hysterectomies in their 20s because another thing that cross sex hormones do is they fuse the ovaries to another part of. I'm not sure. Sorry, what part of the body is? I'd have to look this up. But they fuse the ovaries um, uh, to another part of the body, and that creates decay. That means that the ovaries start to decay, and that means that these young women have to get hysterectomies. So I was seeing young women in despair because they'd suddenly realized that they'd destroyed any chance they had of having children, that they'd shortened their lives. Um, and young men, there was an interview just the other day with a trans identified man, 22 years old, and he was told by doctors that he would literally turn into the opposite sex if he removed his penis. Um, and now he's got a wound down there where he should have a penis. He's a gay man, young gay man, 22 years old. He should be out partying, having a normal life, and his sexual life is over. You know, I just don't know how anyone can ignore it. I don't know how people can ignore Jazz Jennings, who never had a
Mm.
chance, and who's been filmed going through all this, and is now morbidly obese, and refusing to uh, what's the word, dilate the wound that the doctors gave him. You know, this is not a good movement. This is extremely dangerous, disastrous movement for people who get caught up in it. And I don't understand how, for instance, my colleagues on the Father Ted musical can ignore all this.
Mm.
Especially those of them who have daughters. I just don't see how they can ignore it. Like, I don't see how they can ignore the unfairness of men suddenly taking women's places on podiums in their
Yeah.
sports. I don't see how can you ignore it? It's so clearly wrong. It's so clearly unfair. And these young women who would have had sports careers are now leaving their sports because they're so demoralized. One woman said, um, I think she was a student, and she said, "What is the point of training, breaking your back training, if a trans-identified man can come in and just run laps around us?" And I just don't see how anyone can participate in such a grave insult to women. I find it shocking that we're just shrugging at the fact that Eddie Izzard is regularly going into women's toilets. It's like, get out,
Mm.
get out,
Yeah.
you know. And it's like it's not, and I do draw a distinction. I don't believe there's a phrase that people use, true trans, which is much looked down upon because it's like the argument is that uh, transsexuals are different to the cross-dressing men. I do think that's true that they are different. I still don't think they're women. But I do think that dysphoria is a pretty debilitating problem if you're unlucky enough to
Mm.
get it, and it has to be addressed properly. But I don't think you address dysphoria by saying to a man who's convinced he's a woman, yes, you literally are a woman, and you can have access to all women's spaces, and you can have access to all women's sports. I just think that's helping no one, certainly not women, but it's not even helping the people it's purported to help. And I've just been fighting the battle to try and get people to realize that the further down this road we go, the more victims there's going to be, and the more harm it's going to cause.
Yeah.
You know, like
Yeah. No,
So
I
yeah.
get that, and I find a good litmus test of anything in modern society is social media, and again, that's for better or worse. But like on a lot of your videos, or even tweets, or even statements about you, or even articles written about you, like you'd nearly expect with the conditions you faced, as I said, like the cancellation you faced, you'd expect like there is a bit of hate. I'm not going to be naive or ignore that, but like the majority of say YouTube videos about you, you have got hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of women standing up for you, saying you're right to fight their corner and speaking very positively about you. So is there a part of you that sometimes feels that like maybe this isn't my fight to do, maybe if women can lead this I can gather in around them, or is it like stuff like that where you hear women saying keep doing what you're doing, kind of it just nearly boosts you and shows that what you're doing is it's got a purpose and got a value?
Well, I think I know what you're asking, but let me put it this way: if my biggest problem in the last few years is other people not doing their
Yeah.
jobs, the journalists not covering it properly, broadcasters not interviewing people about it. Like I regularly get people on like Maya Forstater and various Helen Joyce, various big names in this fight. I get them on my channel and I speak to them and figure out what they have to say, and lots of smaller names as well, but important
Yeah.
people. People who, for instance, have been you know, uh, bullied and their jobs threatened because of their beliefs. I shouldn't have to do any of this. I was a comedy writer, but no one else was doing it. It just and no one else with my this like a. I had about 900,000 people on Twitter, and then that when I started talking about this, it went down by 300,000 people, something like that. Stop following me. But I still had a fairly significant number of people following me on Twitter. And I felt that it was, I just felt it was immoral not to do it. If no one else is doing it, you have to do it. You know, there's a there's a there's a story, a novel that was very influential on me when I was thinking about abortion as an issue when I was 16 around, called The Cider House Rules. And the main character is a guy who does not agree with abortion, but he is a surgeon and he feels that while abortion is illegal, he has a moral duty to perform them because these women, they used to throw themselves downstairs, they used to drink poison, anything to get rid of
Mm.
the baby. So his thing was, well, if these doctors won't let these women do it safely, then I have to do it. It's a brilliant novel, really, really brilliantly argued and nuanced and very ambiguous and fascinating dilemma for that main character to be in. Um, I'm in a similar kind of thing. I would much rather be writing comedy. I'd much rather be talking about silly
Yeah.
things, the kind of silly things that always amuse me. But unfortunately, the BBC won't talk about it. In fact, you know, recently Doctor Who is started pushing the ideology onto its young audience. I think stuff like that is a disaster. I don't want any more of these kids to be told this corrosive lie that if they take cross-sex hormones, they will turn into the opposite sex. It's evil to tell kids this. And so I have to fight it until it becomes more mainstream. And when it becomes mainstream, believe me, if I can, get back into comedy and make a living through that, I will be happy to do so. But at the moment, unfortunately, this is kind of my life. It has to be because A, it's my only form of income, and B, no one else is doing it.
Yeah. No, well said. And the last question I kind of want to ask is a bit of a sidestep from it, but as you said, if all going well, you can just revert back to comedy in maybe a few years or God knows how long. We hindsight's the best opinion of them all, but we'll see. We'll see how this journey goes. But you said, as you said, you'd like to be talking about silly things, writing comedy, stuff like that. But comedy itself, it's seen well. When I grew up, I always viewed it as an open and creative place, a lot like music, a lot like art, whatever you'd want to compare it to. But in modern society, like in the cinema, for instance, I am hard pressed. I've seen one comedy in the last year, like a true comedy,
Yeah,
and it's even the same where not a week goes by that I don't see a comedian, whether it's the US, UK, or wherever it may be, being attacked due to a comment they said at a live show. So the state comedy is in now. Do you feel it's dead? Do you feel it's dying a slow death? Do you feel it's in a great place? Because like the way I look at it, I feel comedy is in a it's in a very turbulent place and a very uncomfortable place, especially by the creators of it for all the wrong reasons.
yeah, it's in a terrible place. It's in a terrible place. However, there is one good aspect to it. It is genuinely exciting when you see someone like Dave Chappelle,
Yeah,
or when you see someone like what's that guy, Shane Gillis. Um, when you see a show like Mister In Between in Australia, uh, that is a very savage Tarantino esque type crime show. When you do see these things, boy, it's exciting. It's so exciting because it's like, as you say, it's just a time of stultifying conformity, um, self policing, uh, fear of the mob. Like terror of what the mob will think of your comedy. Or, there's a brilliant quote someone said, comedian said, the joke that will destroy my life is already out there.
yeah, no,
You
absolutely
know,
true.
yeah, and basically we just have to get used to the fact that we've all left a trail uh, of comments or whatever it happens to be, jokes online for the last decade or 2 decades. We've basically been living online. We've been living in public, and we have to do something about the people who, for political reasons, use that history to destroy people's lives. You know, we really have to start destroying the lives of the destroyers. We have to turn the tables on these people, you know, because they are bullies with not a creative bone in their body. Most of the comedians who come after me, people like, there's a guy in Dublin, Aidan Comerford, and there's others in the UK. They're terrible
Hmm.
comedians, you know, and they thrive only in this environment because they're doing the kind of comedy that, you know, just no one can find offensive because it doesn't take any risks. It doesn't experiment with saying the unsayable. It's just the kind of, I call it jongleurs comedy. There used to be these clubs around London called jongleurs, and it was always a place where you'd see stag nights and hen nights, and the comedy for me was always it was always very
Hmm.
mid, you know. And they're all jongleurs comedians, you know. They easily get on shows like, you know, Live at the Apollo and stuff
Yeah.
like this, but there's nothing to them. Um, I don't know, but the great thing about that, the potentially great thing about that, is it could lead to a boom in, you know, the kind of comedy that people want to see, that presses people's buttons, that challenges them, uh, that that wanders into taboo areas simply because that's, you know, when people put their guard up, if you make them laugh, it's an even greater victory, you know. So I think that yes, it's bad. It's especially bad for scripted comedy, as you say. It's terrible for scripted comedy at the moment. But again, I think when, you know, like for instance, I'm waiting for the first good podcast sitcom because that's a place where you could get something out very quickly, uh, relatively easily, and you could break all the rules you want.
Yeah.
That's, you know, but for some reason it's just not occurring to people to write it. Perhaps because the fear of the mob is so great. But again, it's another reason why I feel I have to be in this fight. I want to destroy the power of the mob. You know, I really want to fucking stop them being able to destroy people's lives. And once we do that, the field will be clear for writing comedy that everybody, you know, enjoys again. You know,
Yeah.
you can't get comedy by
Yeah.
consensus. You know, and that's what they're
Yeah.
trying to
I
do.
think when you've the likes of Frankie Boyle, or well, not so much him, but like Ricky Gervais having to explain the context before they do the joke, that comes across as harsh. We're in a bad place. Once you start have to explain in your own jokes, we're doomed as a
Yeah,
creative and comedic force. But the
yeah,
the
absolutely.
how I normally end these, Graham, is I just do a few quick fire questions, and then I can let you go
Sure.
enjoy your tea or whatever you'd call your dinner slash supper, or whatever Irish
Thank
term
you.
you want to throw. But yeah, I'll fire away, and anything that the first thing that
Okay.
comes to your mind, feel free to say it. So, first question is your favorite film of all time.
First thing that comes to my mind, favorite film of all time. Was the, oh, that's a difficult one. I'll certainly say in the top three, and I'll pick a comedy one, is The Heartbreak Kid with Charles Grodin, Neil Simon comedy. Charles Grodin plays a guy who marries a woman, goes on honeymoon with her, then falls in love with Sybil Shepherd, and breaks up with his wife on honeymoon. It's one of the funniest films. It's such a great dilemma. It's such a great predicament for a
Hmm.
character to be in that it just kind of the rest of the scenes fall like dominoes afterwards.
Yeah,
Beautiful piece of comedy
cool.
writing. Yeah, I try and track that down
Yeah,
if I
I
can.
haven't seen it, so I absolutely will give it a watch in the next week. So, next
Mm.
one is, what is the best advice an actor or actress you've worked with has given you?
Well, I remember there was a scene where Chris O'Dowd was stuck under a table, and I needed to show that he couldn't get out. And I was shooting the shit out of this scene. I was like putting
Yeah.
cameras everywhere, and I could not figure out how to say in visual terms that he couldn't get out. And I went up to Chris and I finally told him this problem. And he said, "Oh, I'll just look this and I'll go like that and then I'll go, ooh, and then I'll look that way and do the same thing." And that was it. And I think that like one what would have made that day much easier would have been if I'd gone to Chris first and said, I don't know how to shoot this bit, and spoken to, because in the end it really is about collaboration, and yeah, that would have made that day a lot easier, and probably the scene a lot funnier, because I would have been able to stop worrying about very practical geographical things, and actually just tell the story,
Yep.
you know.
Fair point.
So yeah, trust your
Yeah.
actors.
And speaking of actors, this next one's quite self-indulgent for me, but it's probably my favorite gag from your show, Father Ted. So the question I have is, if you can remember or recall, is who came up with the response for Jack to say arse to Mrs. Doyle when she greets him by saying father while passing him during the episode of kicking Bishop Brennan up the arse? If you can remember that scene.
I Oh my god, what, like one bit where he says
It's
arse to a
it's
question?
it's it's when he's locked Bishop Brennan's sidekick, the sarcastic priest, in his
Right.
room, and Father Jack walks by Mrs. Doyle, and she goes, "Father," and he just goes, "Arse."
Oh, that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I have no idea. I have no idea. That was just like, that was just walking. How can we show Jack walking away from having done what he was just doing? And so Mrs. Doyle turns up just to have that little contact with him.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, it's brilliant.
But
Honestly, every time I know it's coming, and I just burst out laughing. It's brilliant.
good. I'm delighted. Delighted.
So next one is, what is the best Simpsons gag of all time? Like a scene or a skit or a one-liner.
The one I've been loving lately is the makeup shotgun that Homer makes, which is like when you only have 4/5 of a second to get ready, and he just says it's a makeup shotgun, turns the gun, and shoots Marge point blank in the face. And then when the camera cuts to her, she's got the makeup all over her face. She looks ridiculous, and she says, "I think you have it set to 4." Extraordinary, extraordinary moment. You know. So yeah, that's one. And nearly every single joke in Clown College, I
Yeah,
think.
great
You
episode.
know, yeah, yeah, work of art, a real work
Yeah.
of art. You know,
And second last question is, what is the worst? Cleaning the dishes, hoovering the house, or changing the bed sheets?
Hoover in the house. That's a pain in the arse. I still can't find a Hoover that actually sucks stuff up.
No, yeah. You see
So
so
yeah,
many ads about Dysons and stuff like that, but most of the people are too lazy to get them. But yeah, I still find them an absolute nightmare to get working and actually do their
yeah,
job. So fair point.
yeah.
And lastly, Graham, is if I could ask you one question I haven't asked you today, what would it be?
Oh man, I don't know, man. You've asked me some pretty good questions. It's been nice. It's been nice to talk about the book, uh, to talk about the fact that it's about Father Ted and the IT crowd. People think that the last 5 years of my life is the only thing the book's about.
Mm,
Whereas it's actually only a small percentage of what's happened to me. Um, so yeah, no, I think you were pretty good on the questions. I wouldn't have any. I don't can't think of anything you haven't
okay.
covered.
Okay. Well, maybe next time you watch that Bishop Brennan episode, think back
I
long and
will.
hard as to
I,
where that originated from.
I'll
Yeah.
try. I'll try. Yeah,
But no,
yeah.
listen, Graham. That pretty much wraps it up. So I just want to thank you for firstly speaking so openly about all the good and the bad that the last few decades have thrown your way, and I do want to thank you for creating a sitcom that I absolutely enjoy, and my family and friends. Like, even when I said you were coming on, some of my friends were sending ridiculous gifts that were Father Ted inspired, no doubt.
Oh,
So I know that a
brilliant,
lot of people will
brilliant.
enjoy listening to this. And for anyone who's interested in your book or even your Twitter page or on your websites, I'll attach all those links below. So feel free to check
Thank
out
you.
Graham. And listen, I just wish you all the best in the next few years. I'm excited to hopefully see you back writing comedy soon. And yeah, as you were saying, winning the war against the mob.
Let's see what happens. Yeah, brilliant. Lovely to talk to
No
you,
worries,
Richie.
Graham. And that